Hi everybody, this is Orlando Mergal with Puerto Rico by GPS. Today we're in San Juan, Old San Juan, Puerto Rico that is. Founded in 1521, it's the third oldest city in the New World. That's after Santo Domingo de Guzman, which was founded in 1496, and Havana in 1515. Today we're going to do something different. Today we're going to visit a place called El Museo del Mar, which in English means the Sea Museum. Many have asked why I've started this series about museums. And there's multiple reasons for that. First of all, you can learn a lot about a country by visiting a museum. And they're great for rainy days, great for indoor fun as well. And September, which is when we're filming this, is hurricane season in Puerto Rico. And while most tourists won't experience a hurricane, they can be reined in. So that's why we're preparing this series, because in case you're reined in your hotel, this is one thing you can do. And this museum is the only one of its kind, by the way. There's no other museum like it in Puerto Rico and probably in the Caribbean. And finally, Puerto Rico is an island, like all of you know. And a lot of its history took place in the sea. So it's only fitting that we visit a sea museum. So let's do that. Let's go to El Museo del Mar. If you're coming to Puerto Rico, you'll probably land in San Juan Airport. You'll probably want to visit Old San Juan and one or more of Puerto Rico's excellent beaches. But what will you do when you arrive in the old city? What will you visit? What'll you miss? And how about the beaches? How do you know which ones are the best and which you should avoid altogether? And more importantly, why? That's why I wrote the Old San Juan Walking Tour and Puerto Rico Beach by Beach, the ultimate guides to Puerto Rico's most beautiful city and most wonderful beaches. But I'm not going to tell you all about them now because that's not why you're here. Just visit the links on screen and find out all about them. Puerto Rico is an island. That shouldn't be news for anyone. And yet, the fact that we have a maritime museum that also holds a Guinness World Record has been a surprise to most of the people I've told. And what's more, it's hiding in plain sight. Well, it's not exactly hiding. It's actually at 360 San Francisco Street, just steps away from San Francisco Parish. That also happens to be one of the busiest streets in Old San Juan. However, for some strange reason, most people don't have a clue that it's there. So why a maritime museum in Puerto Rico? Well, like I said before, the most obvious reason would be that we're an island. But not just any island. Puerto Rico was a strategically important navigational point way before Columbus was an itch in his daddy's pants. Pre-Columbian tribes used Boriquén, as it was called then, as a stopover between the Lesser and Greater Antilles. The Spaniards used it as the last stopover point for the Situado Mexicano, being the first port on the way from Spain to America and the last from America to Spain. And guess what? Puerto Rico is still in the same place. So it's still strategically important for the United States as well. Of course, in these times of unmanned aerial vehicles and intercontinental ballistic missiles, some would argue that Puerto Rico has lost its strategic value. But the fact remains that San Juan is one of the most important commercial ports in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico also has an illustrious military past. The island has seen more than its fair share of battle, and many of history's most famous captains were defeated right here in San Juan. There are several ways to get to Old San Juan, but mostly one way to get to Museo del Mar, as it's called in Spanish. if you're staying in Old San Juan, just find your way to 360 San Francisco Street. That should be easy enough. However, if you're coming from Isla Verde or Condado, your best bet will be to take Román Valdoriotti de Castro Avenue, that's Road 26 going west, follow it to the end, go over the San Antonio Bridge, stay on your left-hand lane, go under the bridge at your left-hand side, and follow the road to the very end. At that point, you'll have no other option but to turn left. At the end of the street, there's a statue of a shrimp. Or maybe it's a seahorse. My excuses. Turn right and you'll be driving along the waterfront. On the next corner, there's a huge bus terminal called Covadonga. Turn right and right once again, and you'll find a ramp immediately to your right for the parking area. This will be your best option in terms of price and availability. If by any chance it's full, there are 2 more parking structures following the street in the opposite direction. Regardless of which parking garage you use, you'll need to find Arturo Somoano Square. It's the square behind the Tapia Theater that I passed at the beginning of this video. You'll recognize it because it's the one with the statue of an orchestra conductor. Once there, walk north along the square until you find O'Donnell Street, and follow it until you reach the corner with San Francisco Street. From there, turn left and you'll find the Museo del Mar several doors up on your left-hand side. When we got to the museum, we met with our host, Mr. Carlos Vera. We actually missed the museum on our first try because the facade isn't too large. Like many establishments in Old San Juan, the building is a lot deeper than it is wide. Vera turned out to be a very knowledgeable individual that dedicated well over an hour to show us the museum. I was curious to know how an award-winning museum like this one got to be in Old San Juan, so that's where we started.
Well, the Maritime Museum first started as a private collection, as more or less like a pet project all the way back in 1976. The plaque behind you actually belonged to that first iteration of the Maritime Museum. Museum quotations, because again, it was more or less a glorified display room. Again, it was just a small project that the owner at the time that did a lot of things in his career, but he was also a history buff on the side. So again, this just started as a personal project, and then it kept evolving. And it wasn't until 2013 when it moved all the way from the docks to here to San Francisco Street, Calle San Francisco, Unit 360, and it turned into the collection that we see today.
The Museo del Mar has hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces in a very small area. So, how did it come about? Who created this museum?
The founder of this museum was, his name is Jose Octavio Busto. He was one of the many members of the original committee, but this collection belongs to Busto's family. So this is more or less his side of the collection. The goal of the Maritime Museum is fairly simple, is education. We want to educate folks, both local and tourists, of Puerto Rico's history that is closely tied to maritime history. Even though there are amazing museums throughout Puerto Rico, this one is the only maritime museum. Busto, he's not with us. He's not on this earth, on this plane of existence. He passed away 2 years now. But he was a guy with a lot of time and with a lot of connections, and also he was just everywhere. You know, throughout his career as a merchant sailor and as an entrepreneur, he kept amassing connections through networking, through all the jobs that he had, and eventually he developed a passion for history, particularly maritime history. So this collection here is a combination of things that were given to him and things that he got through auctions and donations. He in life he used to be a very avid collector. Like he was in touch with all of these things. Wherever auction would pop up, if there was anything of his that had anything of his interest, he would be there. And because of that, he managed to acquire pretty interesting, pretty awesome stuff actually. Although nowadays the Maritime Museum does not buy articles. We don't buy stuff anymore. We if anything, if the collection were to have newer articles, it would be through donations. In the past, couple of years ago, prior to Maria, prior to the pandemic, we actually collaborated with other institutions here in Puerto Rico, particularly the ICP, or Institution of Culture. We did have one very important article that was here for about 2 years, and that was the astrolabe of Rincon. It was found back in the 70s, and that astrolabe, which right here I can show you just a very stylized replica of what it looks like, although we do have more accurate replicas in the collection. Here we had the astrolabe of Rincon, which was a complete and almost pristine condition. Well, the astrolabe is actually a navigational artifact that sailors used for them to not get lost at sea. Sure, the astrolabe in particular functioned as a navigational tool for them to know how close they were to the equator, using the sun as a point of reference. It was found by I think it was the name of the person who found it was I think it had a name of Fitzgerald. I think he was just a casual diver. He found a wreckage, a Portuguese wreckage, and they found a lot more stuff than just the astrolabe. But the astrolabe, in particular, was a very much important because of its pristine condition. There are only 9 complete astrolabes in the world, and about, I think, more than 60, but just fragmented astrolabes, right? But we have one of 9 complete pieces, and right now it's with the ICP, but we used to have we had it here for 2 years.
Being that the museum is rather small, one would think that there are pieces that aren't present all the time, like they switch them around. But Vera explained why that isn't the case.
Yes, the space is rather limited, but the articles that we have and the way we put the museum together is almost, it goes through a very meticulous curating process. Like everything, if we were to take something out, everything has to be rearranged. Again, and if we were to put something in, then everything has to be rearranged again. Just recently, at the beginning of the year, we did receive a photo album that had or has pictures of the Columbus Regatta of 1992. Beautiful album. You'll see it right at the end of the collection. And that one in particular didn't have to go through many inspections. We didn't have to move anything because we already have a part of the collection that is dedicated to the Columbus Regatta. So that photo album quite literally was like the cherry on top. We didn't have to move anything. It fit right in like a glove. We just have to put it there and it's just perfect. Yes, obviously the paperwork has to be done. Even if it's through donations, you can't just take something, bring something to us and just leave it here. We have to provide like receipts and evidence that we received it and that we will put it on exhibition. But with that particular album, we didn't have to do a lot of work because again, it was just, it felt like a piece that completed an entire section of the collection. Who do we want to attract to the Maritime Museum? Well, anybody who is at least a little bit interested in Puerto Rico's history and in maritime history. Here we had tourists, we had locals, we had schools, we had students from all academic levels. I can tell you our favorite crowds are mostly groups of students and people who are actually like in the field. But again, that's just talking from reference. I've had folks who just happened to have a very niche interest in maritime history, and they find the museum and they fit right in. And I had folks who are just as normal as a person can get. They find the Maritime Museum and then they find their interests in here. So it's like a mixed bag. We don't really we don't really have like a particular demographic that we want to appeal to. Like really, we just want to get as many folks as we can from all walks of life.
From this point on, we went into the fine minutiae of what the museum covers. And of course, we're not going to include everything in this video. We're just going to include enough to whet your appetite.
But we have from simple examples of Scandinavian longships. These are two bronze and silver sculptures. But here, if you follow me in to the collection, things get a little bit more interesting. We have original articles, letters from the King Fernando and the Fifth and Queen Isabella the First. These are authentic documents that have been, probably they didn't write it themselves, but it was signed by them. This is more or less like the classic era of this is like the old and the new. This is the old section, and the farther away we get to the more modern section. Now this here, this particular area is very, it's one of the, well, this is where the highlights start to show, because we have the authentic documents. We have this spectacular map that shows the continental U.S., but also it tells you it's a kind of a convoluted item, but it is a very amazing conversation starter, because if you notice, you'll see that the names are all Spanish names. Now we have here a map that shows the exploration, the Spanish exploration of the North American continent, but also their contributions to the conception of the American Empire. Correct. These, the more southern parts of the map were the areas that the Spanish retained, but they basically explored the entirety of the North American continent. Now, the map, and this is where things get a little bit dark, right? Because even though the map, the information on the map from the expeditions and contributions, the dates and the names are all verifiable, they're all correct. But there is no mention of the indigenous perspective. And we all know that even 400 years prior to the 13 colonies, 400 years prior to the Spanish arriving in the North American continent, there were people here, but their perspective is nowhere mentioned in these columns. So it's a little bit of a can of worms, right? There's a colonial expansionist aspect to this map that, ironically enough, it does not want to tell you, but it is ironically also exposing by omitting said information. One of the highlights of the collection, we have the classic Columbus ships, La Niña, La Pinta, and La Santa Maria, and normally, or classically, right, we know these ships to be carabelas, but a small detail is that only 2 ships were carabelas. La Niña y La Pinta, that were smaller, originally fishing boats. The Santa Maria was a now class, NAO class. Now class is it's a completely different type of ship. You can actually appreciate it. Well, these were bigger ships. They were more robust. They carried more stuff. And this is where Columbus was actually traveling in the Santa Maria, which was also the slowest of the bunch, the slowest of the three. Now we have to remember that Columbus did not set foot in Puerto Rico until his second voyage, which was when he brought workers, carpenters, gardeners. But that was when, on his second voyage, that was when the expansion was properly settling itself in, because the first time he didn't set foot. Now this here, this in my opinion, is one of my favorite parts of the museum. And this here is a display of the British siege of 1797. Now, Puerto Rico is, some scholars will say that Puerto Rico is defined by 5 major battles. And in between, we have a plethora of skirmishes. We have the Francis Drake campaign, followed by the Clifford campaign, the Duke of Cumberland. And then we have the siege of 1625, and then it's followed by this battle almost 100 years later, the British siege of 1797, and then culminating with the American invasion of 1898. Now this here is a particularly important highlight in Puerto Rico's history, because we are watching how we defeat the strongest navy in the world at the time, which was the British Marina, the British Navy. Now, there were a lot of things happening on this, at the same time. You know, we have the Napoleonic Wars back in Europe, so we already anticipated a British invasion, so we prepared. And to summarize a battle that took 2 weeks, we defeated the British using an impeccable defensive strategy, but also the courage and just strength of the Puerto Rican people that played an important, almost pivotal role in the defeat of the British. Now it's kind of funny when we get into the details, because the British, when they first come here, they think that they can take Puerto Rico in 3 days, because they have they had a somewhat distorted perception of Puerto Rican society. Thing is, by the end of the 18th century, which is 1797, we're right at the cusp of the end of the 18th century. This is a very different society that we first see when we go all the way back to the 1600s. This is a Puerto Rican that is very familiar with battle. It is very familiar with combat. And it's also a very cynical Puerto Rican. So when they see the British ships, they're not doing it on the service. Well, maybe some of them were doing it on the service of the Spanish crown, but most of them were doing it because they wanted to defend their land, their home, their way of life. And in the case of the peoples that were residing in Cangrejos, which was where the British first made landfall, these were these were communities of free slaves that used to be slaves from the British settlements. So when they see the British ships, they go like, no sir, never again. And there are accounts from the British where they are recounting how terrified they were the nights that they had to set camp, or they were camping on the area, because they did not know who was going to be there the next day, who was going to be on their tent, either absent or dead. So they were using guerrilla tactics to slow down the advancement of the British. Although eventually they did take almost the entirety of the metro area, from Cangrejos, which is today Piñones, all the way to Santurce, here at the very neck that connects Puerta de Tierra to the main island. But the reason why they couldn't advance anymore, because we blew up the only ground entry to the capital city. So the only entrances that they had, the only other entrances that they could use were the San Juan Bay, or trying to go around the island, which they tried, but they failed. They could not they could not succeed, because again, everyone was defending Puerto Rico. As a decree of the governor of Puerto Rico at the time, Don Ramon de Castro, he demanded that every civilian, man, woman, and child, would participate in the defense of the island of Puerto Rico. And sure, there was a military force, but the bulk of it were mostly fighting rebellions in other Spanish settlements like La Española, which is today the Dominican Republic in Haiti. So we were accounting for maybe 1,500 like soldiers proper. But it wasn't until we get the reinforcements, which were close to 1,000 men, that were amassing here on the area of Rio Piedras, that we managed to, by the second week, push the British back to their ships and away from Puerto Rico. So it was a defeat. It was an epic defeat from the British, and an epic victory for us. Now, some folks have asked me, well, does this count as a Puerto Rican victory or a Spanish victory? And what I say to them is that, well, both things can exist at the same time. Obviously, politically, we were a Spanish colony, so obviously the Spanish crown was going to claim this as their victory. But by this point in time, there were accounts of folks that identified themselves separate from the Spanish elites. That even the Spanish elites that were residing in San Juan would refer to the islanders as Puerto Rican. So there was a sense, here is when we get to see a sense of national identity. So because of that, because of said evidence, that we can surely say that this is a Puerto Rican victory over, again, the strongest navy in the world at the time. And this battle did not just limit itself to the land. We had defense forces on the water as well. We had the gunships, which were originally dredge ships that were used to drain the San Juan Bay. They were basically just converted into gunships, like some form of crude improvisation. But here you can see the original mechanism, the dredging mechanism that it had in order to drain the San Juan Bay. So this here were the ships that were used to fend off the British from the sea. Now these were extremely effective because you have a smaller ship that it's constantly moving. So it's a constant moving target against a bigger target that needs to do like 100 maneuvers in order for them to get a good shot. So even if they were capable of passing through the San Juan Bay, they would be decimated by the swarm of gunships that would surround them. And again, they were extremely effective in the defense of San Juan. In the context of the models that we see here, these models were made by the artist Curro Mangas. He is a Spanish modelist. This was a collaboration that we managed to do back in 2017. No, I think it was 2015. These pieces were commissioned exclusively for the museum, and his work is impeccable. Like, if you look him up on Instagram, he not only does like model ships, he does dioramas of everything, literally everything. Like, he started to do, he began with a historical dioramas, but then he was doing movies, and well, his work is spectacular, and the fact that we managed to get him for this collab was a great achievement for little old us here in the Maritime Museum. This statue, although credit where credit is due, it is a very beautiful sculpture, but it also propagates the wrong information. I mean, we could say it is the wrong information. It is technically just religious propaganda, because as we all know, the legend of La Rogativa, it says that the reason why we won this battle was because divine intervention, because these folks had a procession and they prayed and they screamed to the sky, and the British saw them, because the British were Protestants, and we know Catholics and Protestants were mortal enemies. They saw some sort of force field that terrified them, and that they went away. And to this day, there are still folks who tribute this victory to La Rogativa, which we have here in the Maritime Museum. We have to correct them and say, hey, it is not entirely false, because the church was involved in this battle, but the victory was not because of the church's involvement. You know, it was a lot more gnarly than what the legend says, because there were processions, but the processions were in the middle of the battle, like smack dab in the middle of the explosions. There were priests and nuns singing to the soldiers, to Puerto Rican soldiers and Spanish soldiers, for them to not lose courage. So you can imagine them just singing and praying, all the while limbs are flying, buildings are exploding, streets are blowing up. Surreal, like movie levels of surrealness. Sadly, none of that translates to the legend. The opposite has happened. You see that there are depictions of women with torches. So in reality, what happened was that there were women with torches, but these women were actually mostly transporting goods and ammunition from from Cataño to San Juan and back. And they had to have their torches on, because they had to be made visible to the British forces, to the invading forces, because that way it would serve as a form of psychological warfare. Because the moment when we blew up the bridge, the only entrance to San Juan, which was the San Antonio Bridge, they thought, oh, you know, the San Juan is cut off from the main island. So it's only a matter of time. We just have to do a war of attrition, just throw soldiers in there, and they will tire out eventually, because they ran out of resources. But then they see the line. They see the line of torches throughout the San Juan and Cataño Bay. And that's when they know that we could do this all day. We are not alone. We were never alone. And we will keep going until it's over, until the last drop. And that was exactly what happened. By the second week, the British were demoralized. They realized, hey, we can't take San Juan. We are out of here. And they left. And they abandoned everything. And to this day, you can go to La Antigua Arsenal Español. They have a garden there, and in that garden you'll see cannons just lying around, just rotting. Those cannons are from this battle. Here we have two examples. We have a galleon and a frigate. Now this galleon is a fairly modern quotations. It's by the end of the 18th century or mid 18th century, 1725. This is an example of an armed galleon. There were two types of galleons. There were the merchant galleons and the armed galleons. And as the name implies, the merchant galleon was mostly used to transport goods and people, and mostly important folks. And the armed galleon was focused on defense. Now, in practice, we would see these galleons, probably the merchant galleon was in the middle and was surrounded by probably 6 to 5 of other galleons, armed galleons. Again, these were more focused on defense, not exploration. If you were to travel on one of these, it was on a predetermined route. Well, this one specifically is the San Antonio. This belongs to, if I'm not mistaken, 1725 ship. This is an armed galleon, and not the biggest in history, but fairly formidable. And but again, now these ships, although very imposing, they were not, again, the conditions traveling inside these ships were just brutal. There are accounts of people taking months to get from point A to point B. And they were sometimes folks that were fairly protected. We have accounts, there are accounts from nuns who would describe just horrendous conditions that they would sometimes starve. And you know, again, it's not as pretty and romantic as we see in the Hollywood movies. A lot of folks were suffering inside these ships, you know, and you could probably do some things, but it was very, very limited what you could do inside these ships. I remember reading about these nuns that were traveling from Manila, from Spain to the Philippines on a galleon. And they had to, because they were nuns, they were women, surrounded by men, they had to create like a small community amongst themselves to protect themselves. So they had to isolate a corner of the ship where all of them would just huddle together, just to keep an eye on themselves, because they could, if anything would happen to you on that ship, no one would be the wiser, and no one would care, because of, you know, a byproduct of a society where laws were not as efficiently enforced. You know, it was terrible.
In 1898, as a result of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States by the Spanish crown. And although many people would have us believe that it was all peaches and cream, the fact is that it wasn't so simple.
We were, in every sense of the word, the same deal with the British siege. We were fighting back. At this point in time, we have the full-fledged train. We had about 400 schools, public schools, about 40 private schools. We had projects, agricultural projects throughout the entirety of the island. There was one in Mayagüez in particular that was a pioneer of its time. It had to do with agriculture, and it was a unique thing at the time. I mean, this is 1800s, and we also have an observatory here in Old San Juan. Again, Puerto Rico was, as you perfectly stated, it was a very mature society, and we also were having commercial and trade relationships with around the world, including the United States. Evidence of that would be the steamship services that some American companies were providing to Puerto Rico, and this was prior to the American invasion. We were trading goods rum, cacao, chocolate, cars, mail, and even passengers. And one of these companies were the Puerto Rico Steamboat Line. This was a steamship company that was based in New York. And this extended all the way to Europe. This is prior to the American invasion of 1898. So what we have here is all of the building blocks, because we didn't just have all these things, we also have our own currency. We had a currency that was even more valuable than the American dollar. Lest we forget, we had a currency that was more valuable than the American dollar. So all these things were very attractive, but also very problematic when you're trying to take over a people's, because we have to take into account from the perspective of the United States. This is right at the twilight of the 20th century. Spain is losing power. Spain is finally feeling the repercussions of its expansion, and the United States sees that. And it's like, wait a minute, I have to capitalize on this, and I'll start. So you need money. I can technically pay you back the money you lent me, because if we recall the map that we just saw, Spain had a lot to do for the United States to even be a concept, to be able to exist. Spain had to be there for it to be possible. So technically what the United States did was just pay them back the money they gave them. But they were buying off territories. They were territories that Spain could not retain. Which, okay, so I'll buy that from you, and I'll buy Guam, I'll buy this, I'll buy Cuba. But Cuba had its own set of problems, and the Cubans were not going to recognize Spain, and they were not going to recognize the Americans either. So, but when they get to Puerto Rico, that's when Spain goes like, wait a minute. Puerto Rico's kind of going through its own thing also. They're kind of its own country by this point. So this is gonna be a little bit of a problem. So the Spanish-American War blows up. The Americans, not the American people, more or less the governing powers of the United States at the time, they fabricate a reason for them to declare war to Spain, and that's where we get the blowing up of the Maine, and that's like the catalyst for the United States to get involved or to start the Spanish-American War, and but it was all just a land grab, and the problem was that with us in Puerto Rico, from our perspective, it was a full-scale invasion. We were attacked by the North Americans. So a lot of people here would see that, and Puerto Rican society was, there were layers of nuance that we have to take into account when we talk about Puerto Rican society at this time. Yes, there was a party that it was more affiliated to the Spanish crown. Those are more or less the conservative side, right? Those are the more pro-Spain, pro-military. Those were the ones who were always wanted to be part of Spain. But there were also factions that did not want to be a part of Spain, that wanted to secede from the Spanish crown. And when the American invasion came, some of these factions would look at the Americans and they would think, okay, so this may be our ticket out. This may be our ticket out from this transitional period, although we were already heading towards that goal. But again, we have to remind ourselves that prior to this major battle in 1898, there were plenty of other insurrections of Puerto Rico attempting to abruptly secede from the Spanish crown. The most famous one is El Grito de Lares, which was prior to the American invasion, but is again an evidence that we were actively working towards a separation. They were giving us kind of what we wanted, but you still had to pay us taxes. You still have to, if Spain needed soldiers, you have to send them soldiers. And so it was okay. So that was for some Puerto Ricans would see the compromise, but others were not very happy with said conditions. So when the Americans came, they thought, okay, so they help us out, and then we can collaborate with them. Kind of naive if in hindsight, but again, they didn't have a reason to think ill of the Americans when in the past we've already worked with them, or American companies per se. But we were aware that we had trade relationships with American companies. So they didn't really think that there was going to be repercussions, or they didn't know that the Americans were here for supremacy.
Although this museum is a treasure trove of historic information, it has one other thing that has made it worthy of a Guinness World Record.
Here is the largest collection of light buoys in the world. Here in the collection are about 101, 102. But on the Guinness World Record, it's registered as 100. That is the world record of most lifeboat rings or throwables in the world. This part of the collection is the most photogenic part of the. People love to take pictures in this section of the collection. There are ships from many places. We have the RMS Queen Mary. We also have the Grozny from the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You can spend all day at the Maritime Museum, and I actually did several months ago when a friend of mine visited from the mainland, but there was one more thing that I wanted to cover before I end this video.
Well, here we have two identical replicas of the astrolabes that were found on the Antocha, on the wreckage of the Antocha, which was that dated from to all the way back to 1622. Now these are replicas, but even though they are replicas, they still work. You could use them, and these were used in combination with the positioning of the sun. So similar to how to what it shows on the very simple illustration, the navigator would use the astrolabe, and with the sun, the sunlight going through the orifices on the basis of its arms, they would look for reading. With those readings, they would determine the latitude, which would tell them how close they would be to the equator. They could do this in land. They could do this at sea. But these were, these were top tier at the time.
So what you're telling me is that with one of those things, Christopher Columbus knew exactly where he was, even though he didn't know where he was.
Well, actually, Christopher Columbus. But the thing is that Christopher Columbus did not have an astrolabe. He was using a quadrant, which is a lot more simple. It's way more simple. There were astrolabes. The astrolabes did exist by the time of Columbus, but Columbus just didn't own one. He had a quadrant, and the quadrant was very credit where credit is due, right? With very big quotations. Christopher Columbus did know how to navigate, but the quadrant, if you compare the quadrant with the astrolabe, the quadrant is very simple, like a very simple tool. I can't even describe it. It's like a platform. It's like a mason. It's almost like a mason symbol. But the quadrant was a very simple nautical artifact. He didn't have an astrolabe in his possession. From these astrolabes, we go to more modern artifacts that some of them are still used to this day. Now here we have the octants and the sextants. Now the octant is very similar to the astrolabe, the bigger one here, the bigger triangle here. It's very similar to the astrolabe because it does more or less the same thing. It has a similar function to the astrolabe. It only tells you the latitude, and it uses the sun as a point of reference. Now, the mathematical element is always present when it comes to these artifacts. But then we go to the sextant, which is a smaller one over here, and that one is a little more sophisticated. It could tell you the latitude and the longitude. Now, thing is, in practice, both were used in collaboration, because when you were a sailor and you knew how to use these artifacts, but still you have to take into account one of these is more expensive than the other. So what they would do is that they would try to get all the readings during the day using the more robust item, which is the octant. They would take all the readings they could get, and they would just calculate the longitude, and they would have a rough reading. But if you were an experienced sailor and by consequence a mathematician, your readings would be pretty accurate. But sometimes you wanted to be sure, so maybe at night, when you had a starry night, you would take out not the octant, the sextant. The sextant would let you see the stars, and with the stars you could have an additional reading which would give you a more accurate coordinate of what you were looking for, right? Again, like you well stated, I mean, they were not dumb. I mean, these people, if you had to work your way around these nautical artifacts, you had a very unique set of skills. And but because again, if you didn't know what a celestial body is or what to look for, this would be this would just be a piece of brick in your hands.
I could go on for another hour. God knows that I have the footage for it. But then, what would I leave for you to explore? After leaving the Maritime Museum, we walked east along San Francisco Street, turned right at O'Donnell, and walked across Arturo Somoano Square. From there, it was back to the parking. You can also continue exploring Old San Juan for the rest of the day if you like. See you next time.